The horror genre is a genre that seeks a negative reaction from the audience watching, giving them feelings of fear, anxiety, and tension mainly by playing on stereotypical common fears. Horror films have been around for years and years, dating back to more than a century ago. Horrors are commonly focused generally surrounding an evil force, person, or event happening. Also, horror films a lot of the time will incorporate supernatural into their films using mythical creatures like zombies, ghosts, vampires, and things like that. To make a stereotypically traditional horror film, usually a large proportion of violence and gore will be slotted into the storyline as well. Even though horror is its own genre within itself, commonly the genre tends to overlay other genres such as sci-fi, fantasy, and thrillers. Dr. X 1932 was the first horror film to be shot in two-strip Technicolor. The film was directed by Michael Curtiz and features Lionel Atwill starring in the role as Dr. X. Codes and conventions of horrors. Location. Typically in a lot of horrors, the location is based somewhere isolated and usually distant from civilization. Somewhere like a ghost town, woods, forest, a camp, or houses in the middle of nowhere, and places like these. By having a location like this, it creates tension when trouble happens as there is no one else around to help them, and it's almost like they're stranded from the rest of the world. Power cut and phone lines cut. This is a stereotypical aspect to a lot of horrors. The cut of all power and light, along with usually a non-diegetic soundtrack music change, will indicate something bad about to happen or danger nearby. It is also very common for killers and villains to cut phone lines so no outside contact can be made to anyone for help or police. The phone lines being cut add to the creepy atmosphere and effect they are isolated and alone in the situation, making it that much more scary. Often more in recent horror films with more up-to-date technology like iPhones, the convention will usually be the iPhone is out of battery or service nearby, again creating the lonely atmosphere of being stranded and alone. Noises. Typically in horrors there will usually be that one character who want to go out and investigate the strange noise to protect the rest of their group or friends, whatever the situation might be. This character usually always ends up dead or injured by doing this, creating a scare for the rest of the group who are now left without the brave character. Vehicle not starting. This is a very common and well known for horrors, usually during intense chase scenes. The character will run into or to their car and they'll usually not be able to find the right key, fit it into the slot, or the car will not start altogether. This delays the escape from the antagonist and creates an on-edge feeling for the audience watching, as the tension builds as they hope the character escapes. Weather. Stereotypically in conventional horrors, the weather will usually be dark and cold or stormy. A stormy night indicates danger and something bad about to happen as the loud thunder and lightning contribute to a dark atmosphere. Fake scare. This is one of the most overused conventions in horror films, dating way back to new films we see today. The idea is to build up tension towards a jump scare or something or someone bad. However, just as the climax reaches, it is revealed something else that usually is quite normal and wouldn't usually indicate a scare, like a cat jumping out or a shadow of some furniture. The shortcut. Another overused storyline for horrors is the shortcut. This usually involves a group of people or a couple in a car, suggesting they take an unknown shortcut. This shortcut almost always doesn't lead to their destination and will typically lead to some sort of danger that is completely out of the way from any nearby help. The first 5 minutes. Typically in a lot of slasher and killer films, there will almost be someone killed within the first 5 minutes. This will set the tone for the rest of the film and indicate the kind of actions and murders that will happen throughout the rest of the storyline and film. Trips and falls. In almost every horror chase scene, there will always be that stereotypical overused trip and fall scene, where the character is desperately running from the antagonist and will trip on something and fall, usually scattering across the floor and not being able to stand back up so easily. This again creates a lot more tension to the audience and leaves them anticipating to see if they can still outrun the villain. Usually the trip is key for the antagonist to catch up and end up killing the victim. Subgenres. Teen horror. Teen horror is a subgenre of the horror genre that usually will revolve around a small group of teenagers, normally at school or college. Typically these films' casts tend to be quite big and the storyline often involves teenage issues like dating and school events and turns them scary and suspenseful. These films will often always have a very clear antagonist and protagonist also. Some examples of this subgenre include Pretty Little Liars, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and Scream. The subgenre will always involve lots of blood and gore and a very clear antagonist and protagonist. The antagonist will typically have a prop weapon like a sort of knife, and usually the story revolves around their identity being kept a secret and going by a disguise. Examples of this are Scream the TV show, Halloween, and Nightmare on Elm Street. Monster horror. This subgenre usually focuses on the contrast between humans and monsters and the struggle between them. Often, the monster is commonly the antagonist of the film, being seen as terrorizing and scary, and the storyline might often revolve around the defeat of that monster. Examples of this subgenre may include Frankenstein, Godzilla, and Aliens. Zombie horror. These are one of the most famous subgenres of horrors, and a lot of similar films and TV programs have spawned out of the ideas of the living dead. These films often revolve around the survival during a zombie invasion or apocalypse, and the zombies eating the humans and feasting on their bodies. As well as being generally in the horror genre, this subgenre often falls into other genres such as fantasy and sci-fi. Examples of this genre are Night of the Living Dead, The Walking Dead, and Doghouse. Supernatural horror. This is probably the biggest subgenre of horror and can be adapted and created in so many new and original ways. These storylines typically focus in on demons, ghosts, and supernatural occurrences. Religion is quite commonly twisted into a lot of these plots. Examples of this are The Ring, The Possession, and The Exorcist. Mise-en-scene. Setting and location. Often, creepy and dark settings are used for locations a lot in horrors. Stereotypical settings may include something like a forest, a cabin, an abandoned building, and somewhere usually cut off far away from civilization, increasing the audience's fear when watching, as the characters in the film don't have any easy access to help and are alone wherever they are, making it much scarier to watch. It is very common to use locations like these at night to give the audiences watching limited vision as to what they can see lurking around in the location. This gives the creator of the film opportunity to create a lot more jump scares and surprises. Props. Props are a huge part of what makes horrors look so professional and real, like some of the famous ones we know today. These props can range and vary from weapons like knives and guns to something like a spiritual artifact that contributed to the storyline. An example of this is the wooden box used in the film The Possession. If the horror film has a religious aspect incorporated into it, Bibles and crosses will often be used as props also. A cross is almost always used in an exorcism scene, and a well-known example of this is The Exorcist. Often in well-known horror films, certain props that are weapons can often be associated with the character that uses them. For example, when you think of the weapon being a hook, the antagonist from I Know What You Did Last Summer comes to mind. Or when someone says machete, that as the prop that is often associated with Jason Voorhees. Lighting and colour scheme. Commonly in almost every stereotypical horror, the lighting will be atmospheric and dark and eerie. This lighting is commonly used to create an effective setting for common jump scares in the film. Darkness is used typically a lot to conceal an identity and hide someone. For example, when a character is walking home at night in the darkness hides the antagonist following them in the trees and things like that. If an idea like that, for example, was to be shot in daylight, the scene would not give off the same creepy, helpless effect that the night does, and the scene would lose its creepy atmosphere. The use of colour in horror films is also an important aspect. Typically, there are three main colours that horrors will focus on and use for their films, depending on the subgenre. The colour red is usually present in slasher films, indicating danger, violence, and lots of blood. Commonly, black and white are used in horrors a lot to contrast the difference between good and evil in the film. The white in a horror film typically represents the innocent and heroic nature of the protagonist, and the black will often represent the darkness of the character and the evil nature present. Costume and makeup. How costume is presented in horror films is the key to whether the film looks cheap, cheesy, or overdone. The costume each character wears is the immediate indication whether the character is good or bad and their style. The makeup and costume are all a part of the visual aspect of the film and will determine the final look of your film. Again, like props, some costumes from famous horrors can be associated with the characters, for example, Freddy Krueger's red and black striped jumper. Costumes in horrors are usually kept dark coloured and quite simple to add the effect and represent the tone of the film. Often costumes will have blood, splatters, or dirt and mud on them, giving the audience negative connotations and suggest ideas to the audience of the characters being hurt or injured again, adding and creating a scary atmosphere and scene.